Hey everybody, this is chapter 3, video 3. So we're in week 2, and this is the last video for chapter 3. This video will be a little bit longer because we're going to go through all of the different types of organizational structures that they talk about in this chapter. And my dog is chewing on a bone next to me, so forgive me for the background noise. So first of all, when you're designing structures, when you're making a decision of what kind of structure you want to use in your organization, you have to make decisions about a few different things. The first one, the required work activities. And with that, they just mean all the different positions, like what kind of jobs are you going to have? Who's going to do what? And what are those positions going to be called? So you might find that as you go along, we've been operating for a while and you find you need to add some positions. You need to update that organizational chart. So an example of that might be like in a college environment. At some point, they needed to add a Title IX person. Now most colleges have a diversity and inclusion person. They have safety officers, right? So all these things were added along the way as needs were recognized. And then that has to be part of that organizational chart. The second thing you have to make decisions about before you really decide what kind of structure you're having are your reporting relationships. So, in other words, your chain of command. So, how are your work activities in your departments going to fit together within your hierarchy, and who does each person report to? And that'll kind of determine as well how vertical you're going to be or how horizontal you're going to be. And then the third thing you have to make decisions about are how do you want to group together your employees? How do you want to make departments, basically? So that is what determines whether you're going to be functional, divisional, horizontal, or virtual. And those are the things we'll talk about next. So first of all, the functional structure, and this is the most vertical of all the structures we'll talk about. Your activities are grouped together by the business function, and that's when we were talking in the previous video where you have an accounting department, a marketing department, a sales department, the R&D department, manufacturing, etc. Whatever all is needed for your business output, you have a department for it. And those are the ones where I was saying that they can sometimes end up kind of operating as a silo and not really just kind of within themselves, not really collaborating or doing things very effectively with other departments. And that is one of the weaknesses of a functional structure. So all of the skills and knowledge of that particular business function or department are consolidated together. And that's the most effective when in-depth expertise is needed to meet the organizational goals, and the organization is controlled through a vertical hierarchy, like we mentioned. This is especially effective when efficiency is very important. If there's little need for horizontal coordination, it's kind of hard to imagine an organization that has little need for horizontal coordination, but there are, I suppose, some examples of that. So if I were to kind of bring some of the elements together of all the things we've talked about so far between week 1 and where we are so far in week 2, some of the terms that would come up for a functional structure: it's formal, it's specialized and centralized. It's when the organizations where efficiency is important, where they use a mechanistic design, remember that term, where rules and procedures are especially important. They probably use a low-cost leadership strategy like Michael Porter talked about. A resource-based and internal processes approaches to measuring effectiveness, because that resource-based is that really measuring your efficiency of how well you use your resources. And then the internal processes would also measure efficiency. Let's see. And then a vertical structure. So each of these structures in the textbook has a chart that tells strengths and weaknesses, and I don't want to read through the whole chart because I feel like this video is already going to be kind of long. I actually took screenshots of each one and I'll just kind of show you, made like a handout thing for myself to have them handy. I just think that's kind of a handy way to look at them in comparison to each other. I'll just kind of hit on a couple strengths and weaknesses of each one, but just kind of a suggestion for you to maybe make something similar to this. or if you want, I'll email it to everybody just to save you some time. So the functional structure, some of the strengths, it allows economies of scale within functional departments, enables in-depth knowledge and skill development because all of that knowledge is within one department. It's best when there's only one or a few products, and that's kind of important to know. Once you go beyond that, it requires a different type of structure. Weaknesses are its very slow response time to environmental changes. It can cause decisions to pile on the top, the hierarchy overload. So because the decisions are coming from the top down, that's part of that lag time in the slow response to the environmental changes, but also everything has to be decided up here. So that just takes longer. That's just more for them to do. Or if they can delegate down in a more decentralized structure, then those decisions don't pile up there. So, okay, you can look at the rest of those strengths and weaknesses. Okay. Oh, and they also mention in the text, and I think this is kind of important, so you know that these structures, as they're written about in a text, aren't set in stone. So when a functional structure is being used and it's causing barriers to communication between those departments, horizontal linkages can be added. So even though when we talked about horizontal linkages in the last video, we talked about it being part of a horizontal structure, and a functional structure is more of a vertical structure, you can still say, hey, we need to be structured by our functional business units, but we also need our business units to communicate better. So we're going to do XYZ to facilitate communication a little better. And that would be adding in those horizontal linkages to improve communication. Okay, so that's the functional structure. The next one they talk about is the divisional structure. And the divisional structure is sometimes called a multi-divisional or a product structure or a strategic business unit structure. So lots of different names. And they also, the geographic structure that we're going to talk about is a type of divisional structure, just more based on geography. So the divisional structure, the grouping is based on, hold on, my phone's ringing. Let me get that out of there. Okay. The grouping of the departments or the division is based on the organizational outputs. So that means it's either based on the products they make or product groups. So by products, we might say it's based on like Coca-Cola, Dr. Pepper, whatever those drinks are. If we're talking about product groups, if it's grouped together by product groups, then that group might be called beverages, right? So just to kind of give you an example of what we mean by those two different things, it could be those divisions are based on the services provided, programs, businesses, profit centers, etc. Because the divisions can be so diverse, they each require a high level of decision making within that division, and that brings it down from the top of the organization. It's not just a CEO or some VPs making decisions. It has to come down, and that's what decentralizes. It's not up here in the center, it's all across here, all across. Each division has their autonomy in making decisions. So the organizations tend to shift from a functional structure to a divisional structure as they become more complex. So remember with the functional one, I said when they start to add more products, if they have more than just a couple products, then they're going to have to change their structure to a divisional structure in order to be more effective. So once they're shifted, each division has its own set of functional departments, and coordination among these departments should be maximized. So within each department, they each have their own, within each division, they each have their set of functional departments that, marketing, accounting, all those that we always talk about. If they can, a lot of the time those divisions are very different, and so the knowledge is very specialized for each one. But if they can, they'll share some of those duties so they don't have to duplicate them, and that can save some money, but that's not always possible. I'm going to go through the geographic one before I talk about strengths and weaknesses since they're the same. So the geographic structure is when your basis for your divisions is based on your users or your customers. So sometimes, and I think I mentioned this in a different video, sometimes that's based on different parts of the country, like the Northwest or the Southwest, et cetera, et cetera. Other times, if you're an international country, then it's based on either the countries that you operate in or the regions of the world, where enough things are the same in a region that you can make that one business unit. So let's see. So each of the geographic divisions, just like with the divisional structure, each of the divisions, but with the geographic divisions, each of those divisions have their own functions, and it's harder to share, especially if they're an international company, because each division is so different. So the needs, the preferences, the tastes of the customers, the culture of the area, the different laws and regulations that they have are going to be so different from one country to the next that they're going to need their own functional departments. Okay, so then let's look at some strengths and weaknesses. So, strengths of divisional/geographic structures are suited to fast change in an unstable environment because each division can change more quickly because they don't have to go through going up the chain of command and like you would in a more vertical structure. It leads to customer satisfaction because product responsibility and contact points are clear. And it decentralizes decision making, meaning again that all of those divisions each have the ability to just make decisions, right? Some weaknesses: it eliminates the economies of scale, so it's a little bit less efficient. It costs money to have marketing departments in 5 different divisions rather than just one marketing department in your company, right? It can lead to poor coordination across product lines, even though that's actually kind of the point, is to be able to have those horizontal linkages. But when things are so different from each other, sometimes that can be a problem. And eliminates in-depth competence and technical specialization. So because each of those departments, those functional departments that are within different divisions, are operating with a different skill set for whatever that product or whatever that division is, then you have less of that specialization happening. Okay, so that's divisional and geographic. The next one is matrix structure. So with the functional, divisional, and geographic, there was a need for more just one emphasis, like on the product being produced or whatever the output is of your organization. And with a matrix structure, you have a need to emphasize 2 different things, like your product and your geography, or your function and your geography. And so this is used when both the technical expertise and the product innovation and change are important to meet your goals. It's the most complex of all of the organizational structures. And you're going to use a matrix structure when these 3 conditions exist. And I think we talk about this in one of the discussion questions for this week. So the 3 conditions are the pressure to share resources, there is pressure to share resources across the product lines. The environmental pressure exists for 2 or more critical outputs. For example, innovation and new products, or knowledge and new products, or something like that. And then the third condition is that your external environment is both complex and uncertain. So the matrix formalizes horizontal teams along with the vertical hierarchy and tries to give a balance to both. So you both have those horizontal teams, but you also have more levels than with your typical horizontal structure. And often people are reporting to 2 different bosses. So you might be reporting to, let's say, your boss on your team for whatever project you're doing, but you're also reporting to maybe a boss within your marketing function, that kind of thing. So that can be tricky, and they definitely have their weaknesses. Let's see. Let's look at a couple strengths and weaknesses of matrix. these are strengths. It achieves coordination that's necessary to meet dual demands from customers. We mentioned that we go to a matrix. We have two emphases to look at. Flexible sharing of human resources across products, so a way that you're able to share some of that those functional units. And then let's look at a couple weaknesses. It means participants need good interpersonal skills and extensive training. So this is a weakness because this is time and money heavy, right? Causes participants to experience dual authority, which we mentioned before. That can be frustrating and confusing. And it requires great effort to maintain that power balance. So those are some of the weaknesses. Be sure you're looking at these charts, and like I said, I'll email this to the class. Be sure you're looking at those charts and fully looking at the strengths and weaknesses. Okay, I know this is a longer video and I apologize. We're going to get into the horizontal structure now. So the divisional and matrix structures were more horizontal than the functional structure. Now with the horizontal structure, we're fully horizontal. It's the most horizontal of all of them. So an organization it organizes the employees around core processes. So I'll give you an example of what I mean with that in just a second. It's often used when organizations are re-engineering. So you might just use it in an interim before you fully re-engineer into your new structure. And rather than focusing on narrow jobs, it's structured into distinct functional departments. They emphasize the core processes, as we said before, that cut horizontally across the organization and involve teams of employees. So still those teams, I would guess that those 2 pizza teams that Jeff Bezos talked about would have been using a horizontal structure. So it gives the example of Progressive. I thought this was, I think they gave a few examples and I like this one the best. So Progressive went from a customer calling an agent with a claim, and that agent passing it off to customer service representative, and that person passing it off to a claims manager, that person passing it off to an adjuster. Not very efficient, right? Just crazy. That took 7 to 10 days. Now what they've done is they have an adjuster that handles all of that in just hours. They could do most of those steps over the phone with the customer. So all the steps that were involved in the old way were inefficient. There were probably some duplication. There was obviously some frustration on the customer's part, I can assure you. And so now that just makes so much sense. So that core process is everything that had to happen for it to go from the customer to the company having all the information they need to pass it off to the repair shop, right? That's that core process of dealing with the customer. So all the employees who work on a particular process have access to each other for better communication and coordination. The horizontal structure eliminates that vertical hierarchy, and that's not to say people don't have bosses. You have team leaders. I'm sure there's still maybe a VP level, maybe a CEO. There's probably a board of directors. I mean, people are reporting to somebody, but you just don't have as many levels of middle management, which slows things down and makes that team being able to make their own decisions impossible. So the difference between some of the previous structures that we've talked about and the horizontal is that those other ones that I mentioned that were more horizontal than the functional structure, they used some horizontal mechanisms like the cross-functional teams, but they weren't fully horizontal. So they weren't fully structured with teams. That's the difference. Okay. So I'm just going to talk really briefly about virtual networks and outsourcing. Outsourcing, I know you know what that is. You contract out certain tasks. So you can contract out even things like human resources, which actually is really interesting. You can contract out manufacturing, credit processing, lots of different things. I give you the example of Ohio State University contracts out parking. And I noticed when I used to go visit my daughter who went to Creighton in Omaha, they contract out their parking too to the city. So that makes sense, right? And then it's one less thing they deal with. So virtual network structure is the last structure we'll talk about, and they describe that one as being modular, and that's when your firm subcontracts or outsources most of the major functions, like they outsource the marketing, the human resources, the maybe the distribution, to separate to separate companies, and they coordinate activities from a small headquarters. So I can't remember the name of this company. I just saw an ad for these two guys that have a company where they make board games. And it's just the two guys. They're the only employees in the company, but their company is big enough they sell 500 games a day, and they just outsource everything. So it's kind of interesting. Let's see. I think that is everything I wanted to talk about with these last. It does have a chart for strengths and weaknesses of a virtual network structure. I'll let you just look at that on your own because we're already hitting 21 minutes. So that is it for chapter 3, and I will see you in chapter 5, where we don't do chapter 4 next. We jump to chapter 5. So we'll see you later.